So in this video, we're going to cover how to get started in writing macros for VBA. So if you're interested in automating some of the work that you're doing in Excel and you're not too sure how to get started with writing in VBA, this video is going to be a kind of a crash course to teach you all of the basics as well as a couple of tips and tricks that I find very useful to increase your productivity. Now, in order to start writing a macro, we're just going to hop in and just create something really quick. So I'm going to go over to the View tab and go to the macros over here and hit View Macros, and you notice that there's nothing here. That's because we haven't created anything. So I'm just going to write a macro and call it test. So once you hit the View Macro and you hit your macro name and hit enter, you're going to notice this window popping up. So this is basically the code editor for VBA. First off, if we wanted to loop through all of the records on this sheet, there's a couple of things that you need to do, right? So first we need to know how many records there are on the sheet. So for example, if I wanted the total records, I could set that equal to active sheet, which is the current sheet that I'm looking at, used range.rows.count. And if I type this debug.print total records, I would expect 11 to show up here because of the fact that I have 11 records. So let's say I just want to see what the person's name is, or maybe I want to know if the person's name starts with the letter B, then I would like the value true to be populated over here, and if not, then it's false. First, we want to write the for loop to iterate through each of the records. So I'm going to write for I equals 2 to total records, and then next I. So this is the framework for your for loop. So for I equals 2, that means that my initial row that I'm looking at is going to be record number 2. And the reason for that is because if you see over here, the first row, I equals 1, is the header, and we don't care about the header, right? Our first values start at number 2. So for I equals 2, starting at 2 to the number of total records, which is 11. So it's going to go from 2 all the way down to 11, as we expect over here. And after that, it's going to run this code with I set to 1, and once it reaches the end of this, it's going to iterate, increase I from 2 to 3 and so forth and so on until it hits total records, and then it'll exit the loop. So right here, if I wanted to select this particular record, this would be the second row on the second column, which is B. So I could put first name is equal to cells I, and column would be 2. And just to make sure that I have the correct name, I could do debug print first name, and I can comment this one out. And we run this, we're just expecting Brian through Franklin to pop out in our immediate window. And there it is. So now that we verified that we're pointing at the correct cell, how do we see if the first name, if their first name starts with a certain letter? Well, there's a lot of different ways you could do this, but one way that I can show you right now is to just grab the first letter of the string. And one way you could do that is say first letter is equal to, and there's a built-in function in Excel where you take, it's called left, and what you do is you put the string that you're taking, which is first name, and however many letters from the left side you want to extract from there. So in this case, I just want the first letter, and just to verify that I'm getting the first letter, let's type in first letter, and I'm just going to clear this out, and let's run this, and it looks correct to me. Yep. So what we're trying to do now is to check if the first letter is B, then populate true on column D, and if it's not, then populate false. And that's where we would utilize an if statement. So if first letter is equal to, and we use the letter string B, then, and you put end if down here just to close your if statement, then cells I, because we're checking, for example, if I is equal to 2, we're checking Brian over here because I2 is the first name, Brian, then we would, if Brian starts with a B, then we would want the same letter 2, 4 to populate with the number, with his name, right? So I4 equals first name. And then we would do else. Oh, I'm sorry, hold on. It shouldn't be first name, right? We want it to be true. Let's change that. True. And we have the else here, cells I4 equals false. All right. Now we run this and I'm expecting to see the first 4 records to be false, true, and the rest of them to be false. And there it is. Perfect. Now the next thing I want to talk about is taking a step back and discussing this environment variable over here, ActiveSheet.useRange.rows.count. Now, how did I know that this was even a thing? Well, me personally, I learned this from Google, but if you wanted to, one thing that you could do is take advantage of the Microsoft documentation. So in the years when I first started using VBA, this documentation was not that great. In fact, it pretty much didn't really exist. So I relied heavily on using online forums in order to figure out how to do things. But these days, you can pretty much take a look at the application doc. So all you have to do is type in like VBL Excel worksheet object, and it'll take you directly to the Microsoft docs. And over here, for example, you can see, I know that's a lot to look at, but it shows you all the different applications with VBA. And in this case, what we're concerned with is the object model and the application, which then teaches you, there's certain properties within it, like the active cell, active chart. In this case, I used active sheet in order to select the particular sheet that I'm on. If you're curious about what certain properties are available, then take a look through the docs and you'll be surprised. There's quite a lot of useful things. But let's say I don't want to select the active sheet. Instead, I want to select a specific sheet instead. So there is a sheet object over here. Yeah, so there's a sheets object, and you can do what you can do is you can select it as well by naming it. So what I can do over here, for example, let's go back to this workbook. You see that there's another sheet. There's one sheet over here called city, another sheet over here called people. The one I'm selected on is people, but let's go over to this module that I created. So in this module, I'm just gonna select a sheet. So select city, and I'm gonna call it, I'm just gonna type in this sheets city dot select. And when I run this, this page should automatically switch over to the city page, which it does. Now, if I wanted to go back, let's say I select city is equal to city, people is equal to people. And the reason I'm typing this is because in the future, right now, it's trivial because city and people is a very easy name to type, but some worksheets, you might have kind of a really complicated name that you don't want to have to end up typing every time if you're constantly jumping back and forth between sheets. So it's just easier to use like shorthand for it. So let's say I select sheets. Now I'm going to go back here, sheets, people.select. So if I don't have to remove this since the last thing that I'm selecting is the people, but this should take us back, and it does. So another useful method that you're probably going to end up wanting to do is clearing out a sheet. What I'm going to do here is I'm just going to clear out this particular row, this particular column. So I could do range, and in this case it would be D2 to D10 or D11, and then just type in clear. And if I run this, it should remove all of this out of the way. Perfect. Now, going back here, if I rerun this macro, it'll repopulate everything here again with what I had before. But one thing that I want to mention here is if you're not exactly sure what range your data is at, you could always just do an absurdly huge number, or you could do the you could assign the string as the active sheet.useRange.rows count environment variable. Okay, so that's how we select sheets, and how is that helpful to us at all? Well, one thing that you can do over here is you can run 2 separate for loops in order to kind of iterate between the 2 macros. Now, people can say like, yeah, you could use VLOOKUP for this, but the thing about VLOOKUP is, what if your data isn't fixed? What if you're constantly changing the sheet size and the sheet dynamics and the sheet location? This is where VBA comes in, and it's very, very useful in that regard. So let's say, for example, over here, just for quick and ease, I want to grab the customer city and populate it over here, but I want to grab it based off of the city ID, I'm sorry, the city name. So I want the city name to be populated based off of the matching customer ID. So if the customer ID based off of here matches with the city ID, then give me the corresponding city name over here. So how do we do that exactly? Let's go back to our module, and I'm gonna just delete this. Well, you know, we could keep this, and let's just type in sub city name, okay? And what I'm gonna do over here is I'm going to get the number of rows again. So let's call this people recs equals active sheets.usedRange.rows.count. But first, let's make sure that we're selecting the people sheet, because if you don't put this and you run the macro when you're looking at the city, then it could end up, you know, giving you the record count for the city, and you don't want that. So we did that. Next, we're gonna grab the number of records for the city. Okay, so we have the number of records on the people table, the people sheet. We have the number of records on the city sheet. And what we want to do is we want to iterate through this and check the city table. So this is a pretty inefficient way to do it because I'm doing 2 nested for loops, but just to keep the example as simple as possible, bear with me here. So what I'm going to do first is write a for loop. So I'm going to make sure that I'm back on the people sheet. And for I is equal to 2 to people recs, next I, and we're going to get the customer ID, right? So we're going to grab cust ID is equal to cells I1, because we're looking at cell I, which is row 2, and column 1, which is A, and that's where the customer ID is. And once we get the customer ID, we're going to jump over to the city table. So sheets, hold on a second. Let me make sure that this is actually in the for loop, because we want to make sure that we're reselecting it. So we're going to jump over to sheets, city, select, and when we jump over here, what are we going to do? We're going to do a for loop for j equals 2 to city recs, city rec, next j. We're going to say right here cust city ID is equal to cells j1, right? Because we want the customer ID to match. So if cust ID is equal to city cust city ID, then we're gonna get the city is equal to cells J3, and we're gonna exit our for because we don't need to search anymore, right? End if. Now, in the situation that the customer ID doesn't happen to be here, we should set the city equal to nothing, right? And we'll have a little if statement over here. If city equals nothing, then debug.print no city exists. Right. So we're gonna jump back over here. Now that we have our city, we're gonna jump back over to the people sheet. So we're jumping back, and we want to populate the city that we found over on this column. So we would do cells I5 equals city. So by doing this, I'm expecting the city to get populated. The starts with VB should also get populated too, right? Well, probably not, because I didn't, I wrote that in a separate macro. So this is a very simple way that you could utilize to write and match up and combine data on different sheets into a single sheet, if that's what you're trying to do. Once again, I did say that doing 2 for loops, like, I'm doing a for loop where I'm cycling through here, and each time I cycle through here, I'm then cycling over on this side. There's a lot of different things wrong with this, but the key one is that it's really slow. For those of you who are working with larger data sets and are interested in how you could do this a little bit faster, I recommend that you look into dictionaries. So that's pretty much it for this video. I know it didn't cover too much, but hopefully it was enough to get your feet wet and familiar with the subject of VBA. So if there's anything else that you're hoping that I could have covered in the video, then please leave a comment and let me know. Otherwise, if you found the video helpful, then please leave a like. Till next time.